Okay, so Suzanne, it was a real pleasure to meet you at the Disrupt HR conference, and we got talking. And not only was your talk outstanding, you were the person opening the conference, and um, it was so memorable. I can even remember your first line, which is, "Has anyone ever come to you with a really terrible idea?" And in a moment, the entire audience was captivated just by the opening line. And I found out through our short period of time together that you do improv, and I can see how that capturing the audience, is a skill. And I'd like to understand more about you, HR, and improv, and how one informs the other.
Well, all right, because those are the things that I love to talk about. And it was so, I love Disrupt HR so much. I think it's just the best. It's it's the best HR stuff you get. It's
Mhm.
far better than any conference with stuffy talks.
So, well, yeah, I mean, but you you've probably done yourself a
Except for conferences that
disservice
I speak
because
at,
you
in which
speak
case
at
that's the
many
best.
conferences, many conferences.
I, I do many conferences and I hope to do many more.
Okay.
Hire me. Sorry.
So, so was your approach to Disrupt HR different in any way from what you would do at other conferences?
Um, the different thing is that Disrupt HR is so short.
Hmm.
So, for if you have listeners that don't know, it's a 5 minute speech and you have 20 slides, and the slides automatically advance every 15 seconds. So, it really forces you to stay on script and on time. You can't have one of those conferences where I have been to them where you can see like the people running the conference standing in the background to the people speaking, and they're just like, "Oh, I'm gonna go ahead." And I know from being a speaker that they'll have like a flashing red light. And I've had speakers say, "Oh, I'm just gonna ignore that because I want to finish." And I'm like, "Oh," but you can't do that in Disrupt HR because your slides just they keep going. Um, so with Disrupt HR, I approach it as I need one little tiny idea. And then you can only do a tiny bit of a tiny idea. Um, so I try to keep it to that one thing. And you can't bring in all of the ifs, ands, buts, because there's just 5 minutes. So it is trying to condense it down to that one idea. Although, to be fair, I find for a conference talk when I'm doing 45 minutes or an hour, you also want to have a pretty narrow topic of focus so that when people walk away, they can take two or three messages and that's it.
Hmm.
Like, you're never going to be like, here is how you're going to restructure your entire organization. Although people try, and those talks aren't great because you can only give general principles. I can't tell you how to restructure your organization when I don't know what your organization is now. So saying, oh, you should do this matrix thing, or you should do blah, blah, blah. Maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't.
I'm interested in that insofar as we live in a world where people are kind of looking for three-step plans, get rich quick, microwave food, easy recipes, simple formulas. And one of the references that you made in the Disrupt HR conference was this idea of a dumpster fire. And I imagine that as an HR person, you've come across a few dumpster fires.
There's so many dumpster fires within HR. Some that we cause. And I will be honest, there are a lot of terrible HR people out there. There are. There's a lot that shouldn't be there. Um, but a lot of the dumpster fires are caused by people ignoring HR advice.
Mhm.
And people see us as, the school marm, oh, there's no fun. Oh, she's always trying to make rules. Um, our primary goal is to help the business succeed. And you can't succeed as a business if you're in massive legal trouble or if everybody hates each other.
Mhm.
And and so yeah, we're not a lot of fun,
Mhm.
but the reason why we're not a lot of fun on a lot of things, like, okay, we're gonna have an open bar. No, no, we're not going to have an open bar. Mm-mm. We're gonna have two drink tickets with your names on it so you can't pass it off to someone else.
Mhm.
Well, that's just horrible. Okay, but we're not at a wedding. We're not at somebody's bachelor party. Um, we're at a business function where when people get drunk, they say things they shouldn't say, they do things they shouldn't do, and then some of them get into their cars and drive,
Mhm.
and people can literally die. So yeah, if I'm the one that supplied you the alcohol, I don't know what the law is in the UK, but in the US, I have an obligation if
Mhm.
I supplied the alcohol to make sure that you don't get in your car and drive drunk. So yeah, I'm going to limit you to two drink tickets
Mhm.
because
And
I'm fuddy duddy.
how does advice change, if indeed it does, of course, in a world where the demarcation between private life and business life is increasingly becoming blurred? And whilst you are perfectly entitled to your private interests, actually, if they start encroaching on business, but then business now encroaches on our personal time, we're always on, we're working from home. How is managing HR made easier or harder when the boundaries are collapsing?
I think it's a lot harder
Mm.
because back in the old days, because I'm old and I suspect you are too. Um, um, what you did on your own time, I never would know about it. How would I know about it?
Mm.
If you went out with your friends and you told all sorts of racist, sexist, horrible jokes, I wouldn't know, and
Mhm.
neither would your coworkers.
Mhm.
And so all that mattered was your behavior from 9 to 5.
Mhm.
And and really I still support that philosophy. I don't care what your personal beliefs are. I care about your behavior at
Mhm.
work. But now you go and you tweet it and you put it on Facebook and you feel like you're having a conversation with your friends.
Mhm.
And I even had once where I was writing an article and there was somebody posted a thing on Twitter and it went viral and I shared a bunch of quotes from it. And the person that had written the viral tweet messaged me and she was furious. I'm going to sue. That was a private conversation with my friends. And I was like, no, it wasn't. You go ahead and sue me. You can guess that nothing happened. It wasn't a private conversation. And as I pointed out to her, the terms and conditions of Twitter is such that I can embed your tweets. Like I can do that. That's part of the deal. You signed up for that. But she felt like she was having a private conversation
Mhm.
and she wasn't. And so you find out things about people that you didn't want to know,
Mhm.
right? And and then what do you do with that information? And that's just the social media side of thing. The other thing you said about these lines blurring, um, this is an unpopular opinion,
Mhm.
but I am not a huge fan of the 100% remote work. Now, I'm very hypocritical on that. I have worked remotely off and on since my oldest child was born in 2003. So I
Mhm.
was cool before it was cool. And then I've worked remotely exclusively as my own company for the last 15 years. So, um, I am here at my desk that's in my bedroom. And there's a lot of advantages to that, but it blurs those lines. There's no Like there used to be a, oh my gosh, I'm done.
Hmm.
And you couldn't do anything about it until the next day.
Hmm.
Um, you know, I am young enough that I always had a computer at work, but I didn't have a laptop
Mm.
at work um, until I started working in pharmaceuticals in 2001. 2001. Um, so those years before, you know, when you turned off the computer, you were done. And I had a cell phone, maybe. I don't remember when I got my first phone, but it was just a phone. It wasn't, you know, all of the email and all that. So there was this clear end of work, and weekends were really weekends. And when you went on vacation, you went on vacation. There was you didn't leave your itinerary with your boss because your boss would have to call the hotel and be like, "Hey, can I speak to Suzanne Lucas? So she's in room 204." You know, like that didn't happen. And now we have this expectation of I'm going to be available all of the time and my lines are blurred. And even if I work in an office, I bring my laptop home, I bring my phone home, and and so you can text me, call me, send me an email at any time, and it's on me, the employee, to set those boundaries for myself to be like, I'm not going to answer that phone call from Tim. I'm not
Mm.
going to answer it. And some bosses are rational and some are not.
And I'm curious on how those boundaries work or don't work, or how we can use that to our advantage. Now, for example, if we take your other persona, which I think is marvelous, evil HR lady, um, how how different is evil HR lady from Suzanne Lucas, the person whom we might hire? I mean, are they synonymous? Are they different sides of the same coin? Is it a problem or is it an asset that you have this other persona?
I don't know that it is another persona. It is just me. I chose the name because when I started writing on the internet
Hmm.
back in 2006, I was working in pharmaceuticals, which is a very conservative industry,
Hmm.
still is quite a conservative industry. And blogs were new,
Hmm.
and the social media didn't, I mean, MySpace existed, but it wasn't a thing like it is today.
Hmm.
Um, Social media didn't really exist. And so I needed a pseudonym to write under. Um, and so I picked Evil HR Lady because people have a negative attitude towards their HR department. And I literally picked it in like a minute, 30 seconds. I was like, oh, I need a name. Okay, this.
Hmm.
Best branding I could have ever done.
Hmm.
Because who can remember Suzanne Lucas? Nobody. People can't even say it right. They call me Susan all the time, which I'm not, but I will answer to that because I live in Switzerland and they can't say the za sound in Suzanne. There is no za in German, so they can't say it anyway. Anyhow, um, so I think when I started, Evil HR Lady was a little bit bolder than I was because it wasn't under my name, so I could say exactly what I thought without, and I was also naive in thinking that nobody could track me down,
Hmm.
which, if you're listening now, even if you're writing under a pseudonym, people can figure out who you are. So I was a bit naive in 2006, but I could say what I felt without fear of my boss finding out. Although my boss herself would have thought it was funny, but other people might not have. Um, so as I merged the Suzanne Lucas with the evil HR lady, I continued with that boldness, and that is something that I've had several people come up to me after talks at conferences and be like, "Oh my gosh, I love what you said. I wish I could say the same thing, but I can't. I can't, you know, like because it would be too disruptive." And and, and because I work for myself, I can say what I want to say. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have clients. I do have clients and they could fire me for something I said. It's possible.
But I'm really interested that I'm going to take this in a direction it may not have been your intent,
Okay.
but it says something about culture, or maybe I'm loading it to be something about culture. This
Okay.
idea that we all tacitly agree, but we also agree that possibly you shouldn't say that. Or the anonymity of something allows you to say something that some would agree with, but it's felt that you possibly shouldn't say that. And I think at the moment, possibly more than any other previous time, I think in the past we've been obsessed with brands. I think right now we're all pretty obsessed with culture. And what I find really interesting about this sort of culture thing is that this dilemma where we want to have diversity and inclusion and variation and innovation, and we all must sing the same company song, have the same values, have the same behaviors. There's a sweet spot somewhere in there that needs to be achieved. And of course, you spoke a little earlier of this idea of things that you would say privately and the things that you would say publicly. I mean, how do you feel, both yourself, Suzanne, and as an HR person around this whole melting pot of cultural views, issues, perceptions, needs, wants, desires?
Well, you said two things there. One is we all have to say the same line, and then the multicultural melting pot. Those two things are not consistent with each other.
Hmm.
And and this is why in the US and to some extent in the UK, um, you see a backlash against this DEI, the diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's a backlash against it, but it's not coming from people that that the proponents of DEI will say, oh, if you're opposed to DEI, it's just because you want white men to rule everything.
Hmm.
Whereas the people that are backlashing against it are saying that the opposite is that I want everyone to be able to be themselves. And if you have a difference of opinion, have a difference of opinion. And don't say that same line because that whole concept of diversity and inclusion, and I'm skipping equity on purpose, um, is that we have different people with different ideas and we all can work together. And a lot of people think that that is impossible.
Hmm.
But I actually think, and again, this is where my head gets cut off, and I'm sorry for ruining your podcast with blood spurting everywhere. Um, where work from home doesn't help
Hmm.
because if I know you as a human, then it doesn't matter what your race, ethnicity, national origin, religion is. I know you're a normal human. But
Hmm.
if I only know you through the occasional Slack message and you're the person I send the report to monthly, I can put up in my head that because you are this, and this, you're a horrible person that hates me because I'm that, and that. Um, one of my many hats is I serve on the board for the English Panto in Basel, Switzerland, um, which as an American is kind of funny too. So here I am as an American in Switzerland serving on an English Panto board.
Hmm.
And and our last performance in December, we had a cast of 28 and then a crew of I don't even know how many. 1 million. It takes a lot to run a panto. And we counted the number of native languages that we had among the cast, and it was like 12. You
Hmm.
know, like, can you even come up with 12 languages? It was like 12 different native languages from all of these different cultures. We had um, incredibly religious, runs a ministry Christian. We had a transgender, super off the deep end liberal, like
Hmm.
this whole and everything in between. We had races, genders, age. Our youngest cast member was 8. Our oldest cast member, I don't know, 60 something. Like everybody got along beautifully. We never had fights on set. Everybody loved each other. You would see people with their arms draped around each other. We all had pictures and it was the most diverse group of people you will ever come across in Switzerland. So we are limited in Switzerland, but because we were all working towards a common goal, we wanted to put on the best panto ever, which we did. Personally, think so. We wanted to do this one thing, and so we were all focused on this goal, and it didn't matter what our political views were, or what our family situations were, and one of the things that CEOs are cautioning against, and you see people coming out with reports of this, is that people who work remotely aren't engaged with the company. They don't have any company loyalty. And
Mhm.
part of that is on the heads of the company. I talk fast and I talk a lot, sorry. Because they no longer had any loyalty to their employees, right? We're done with you, go. But when employees aren't engaged and they're not supporting the company, then I'm focused on me, you're focused on you, and now we're going to clash because we have different views. Whereas in our PantoCast, we were all focused on one thing. We wanted to do it on this play. So it didn't matter what you thought and what I thought. What mattered was how we were acting, which, by the way, I'm a terrible actress. But we all were working together. And I do see that as another problem of this disconnected, because we're simultaneously disconnected and always connected. So I know what you ate for dinner last night because you posted it on Facebook. Actually, it's not true. I don't know what he ate for dinner. I don't know what I ate for dinner last night. But also, you're stuck here and I'm stuck here, and it's not working together. It's a problem.
I think it's interesting and worthy to explore you, how this works in teams. Okay, and maybe what you've learned. You touched on panto there, but also improv. We had a chat when you were in Jersey, just talking about how improv is completely improvised by definition, but at the same time, there is some structure to it. There is a sort of common understanding, and when you're talking about the panto there, you talked about goals, and one of the things I'm interested in is proximity. I think many people may have seen a video that's quite viral of these two dogs absolutely going at each other through a fence. But when the fence is removed, they're very tame.
Right.
And when the fence is replaced, they're barking and vicious and snarling. And I think it's really interesting that you can have people who strongly disagree online. You put them in a room side by side, and suddenly they moderate. They moderate. Not least because you possibly could get punched or whatever, but proximity does change relationship, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And that is one of the reasons I run a Facebook group. We have 31,000 HR professionals in it. And people want to post anonymously all of the time.
Mhm.
And we only allow anonymous posts where it's potentially embarrassing, or you're asking a question about running a reduction in force. Of course, you don't want that information to get out before, something like that. And the reason is precisely for that. If I have someone saying something anonymously, people are far more prone to attack that person. But if it's with their name and their picture, they're less likely to attack. Now, we don't allow attacking anyway. If you attack somebody, you're out.
Mhm.
I don't need you in my life, right? Um, but it's for precisely that reason. Because when you're hiding behind a screen, you're like, and you don't think of that person as a real person, you never say that to their face.
Mhm. But this thing about proximity is interesting, I suppose, in the context of improv as well. I mean, it's a poor metaphor, but the one that springs to mind is a chessboard. The pieces only have significance when they have proximity that is relevant to the situation you're in. Otherwise, they're way off in the distance, and who really cares? And of course, in improv, where you may have several people on the stage at any one time, there is, well, I'm assuming there's a focus around the dialogue, and then people go forwards or backwards and they move like chess pieces.
There's a lot of movement, and you're right, there is generally a focus. Um, One thing that you'll discover if you do improv, which you should, and I mean that literally. I mean that because it's really good for helping with your public speaking, with your presenting, with your ability to have a conversation, your ability to listen. All of those skills are enhanced through learning improv comedy. It's not something that you should do just because you want to be up on stage, which if you want to be up on stage, excellent, but it's not just for those people. Um, is that it's so much easier to have a cohesive two-person scene than a cohesive three-person scene. And
Mhm.
a four-person scene becomes harder and harder because trying to integrate more people into it, because there is that conversation between whoever is speaking that becomes that focus. And you often in a two-person scene, you have these two people speaking at a third wheel. And if you have a four or more person scene, you often end up with two separate scenes going on, this scene over here, this scene over here, and then that makes for a terrible scene. So it is that focus of whatever it is, and it's very, very difficult to integrate more people into it. And we actually, when I teach beginning improv, we don't do three-person scenes because it's difficult to do.
And that's really interesting because one of the things we did talk about, we have a shared interest in teams and team coaching. And so I get involved in both business and sport coaching. And say, for example, as a performance rowing team, you have four crew people in a quad and then a cox. So I would always facilitate a conversation with all of those people there because they are one team but have different views. But I
Right.
can see that without modest structure, it's just a cacophony of noise and opinion. But at the same time, I welcome that diversity of opinion because if you're looking at what makes the boat go faster, actually, maybe it's the person who shyly says, "Oh, I had this observation," is the one that you want to sort of draw upon. And I'm interested from an HR perspective, how we manage communications in teams. You may or may not know her, but there's a lady called Nancy Klein who talks about speaking in a thinking environment. And I love the idea of a thinking environment for the purposes of dialogue. Do you want to share some of your experiences around teams and coaching?
Well, there's teams are a complicated thing because like you said, with your rowing team, you have a singular goal,
Mm,
right? You want to make the boat go faster. And you're not focused on all of the other things. And ideally, a team has a focus,
mm,
but a lot of times within a business, we're a team, but I'm focusing on this, you're focusing on that, right? And the idea is that together we have this. But a
mm,
lot of times we don't even know how your piece fits in with my piece.
mm.
And that's one of those things that I see a lot in teams that I don't understand. And everybody has this belief that everybody else's job is easier.
Yeah.
Why can't he get that report done on time? It's so easy. All he has to do is put in the numbers, right? And then the other guy's over here going, why is she so whiny about this? This is so hard. I have to, you know, and we don't understand what other people are doing. So we label a team, but we're not on the same focus.
Mhm,
And and so that's one thing that I find really powerful in team building is to get everybody to understand what other people's roles are because we only see the end result. Um, and I have a personal story about the fallacy of the end result. Years ago, I ran layoffs for a Fortune 100 company, and it's a pharmaceutical company. And if you know anything about pharma, it is that it expands and contracts and expands and contracts because if a drug gets approved, then we need to expand our field sales reps. If a drug goes off patent, we have to contract because we're no longer selling that. If a drug looks promising, we're going to expand our research teams. There's a lot of expansion and contraction. That's the nature of pharmaceuticals. And so my job share partner and I, we ran the layoffs. And at the same part, we were working on outsourcing the transactional part of HR.
mhm,
So they were going to outsource all of the behind the scenes transactional stuff. And our job got put on the chopping list.
mhm,
And we're like, this is not easy. And the outsourcing firm showed us what some random executive had done, which was our job was to print out documents and put them in a file folder to give to the manager to hand to the person when they informed them that their job was over. And of course, you can outsource printing of documents and putting them in file folders. And 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 we were like, who writes those documents? They're
Mhm.
like, aren't they all written? We're like, well, some of them are, but they are legal documents, and we cover all 50 states, and each state has their different laws. So you need to update them. And they're like, oh, well, who updates them? We're like, that'd be us. And we're like, and here's how we do the statistical analysis to ensure that we're not um, laying off people based on race, gender, age, all of that stuff. They're like, oh. And finally the outsourcing firm came back and said, no, we can't do that job. And it's that fallacy of the executive that put our names on the list. All they saw was this file of papers that we handed. So they assumed that all we did was print out papers and put them in folders. And I was like, have you ever looked at my salary? Why are you paying me that much? But they, of course, thought that they could then replace me for somebody at $10 an hour. No, you can't do that. And that's one of those fallacies that pops up, that just because your end result looks easy to me, it means it was easy for you to create. And that can cause tension in teams as well. So I really like people to understand what the other people do. I'm a big fan of job shadowing, not necessarily so for I take over your job, but so that I understand. And then I can also be more supportive of you. And maybe I have an idea that can help you. Um, Maybe I do. Maybe you have an idea that can help me, but you don't have that until you know what I do.
I'm interested in this depth of knowledge that goes into jobs, in part because job changes become more frequent. We're in a sort of, you talked about expansion and contraction in pharmaceutical. I think it's expanding into other areas. And
Absolutely.
we're seeing now a recruitment that says things like we should recruit for attitude, not for skill. And if we have the right attitude, we'll teach them the skill. But I think sometimes we don't recognize the value of skill or process. The example you gave, I think, is a really good example of that. I mean, as an HR person, what's your view of this recruiting for attitude as opposed to skill? And if you are purely recruiting for attitude as opposed to skill, what's the L&D budget looking like to actually address that skill gap that you literally recruited for?
That is a beautiful statement right there, that the skill gap that you recruited for. So I'm of two minds of this. One is just about anybody can learn to do just about anything.
Mhm.
So if you have the desire to be an accountant,
Mhm.
you can learn how to be an accountant.
Mhm.
Um, you can do that. Full faith in you. I don't know, maybe you were an accountant in a past life. I don't know. But you can learn that.
Mhm.
Absolutely. The question is, for if you want to train me to be an accountant, there's a lot of skills I'm missing, right? Um, it's going to take a lot of effort. I can have the best attitude in the world,
Mhm.
but if I don't have that foundational skill, um, so skills are important, but it's also important to recognize that things can be learned.
Mhm.
There are some horror stories. Peter Capelli, he's a professor of management at the Wharton School in Pennsylvania. He wrote about a company that had 29,000 employees, 29,000 candidates for a single position. And their applicant tracking system said that none of them were qualified. And he blames it on technology. I blame it on a hiring manager and a recruiter that are dumb as rocks. Because I don't care if I pulled 29,000 people at random, I could fill every position that this company had, you
Mhm.
know. maybe with just a little bit of training. So a lot of companies want what we call in the HR world a purple unicorn. You
Mhm.
know, that's just got every single possible thing. Or often it is, I want an exact replica of the person who just quit. So, and those are unrealistic. So we say recruit for somebody that can learn to do the job.
Mhm.
But there's a difference between hiring a junior accountant, somebody that's had, 5 years of experience into a senior accountant role, than hiring me into a senior accountant role because it's going to take years and years and years and years of work to get me to that. The junior accountant has had 5 years of experience, maybe he's not quite ready for that senior role, but there's a small gap that they can learn from. And and so in that, if I'm interviewing, it's like, do you have the desire to learn? But do you
Mhm.
have the knowledge base and the skill base that it's likely that you're going to be able to learn quickly? And as you said, with the L&D budget, we're blessed right now with I can go online and find a relatively inexpensive class for anything.
Mhm.
Anything. You want to teach me cheese making? I can do that. You want to teach me, microbiology? I can find that. All of it is there. But companies don't put money into it. They don't put money into this training and development. I cannot tell you the number of times, I mean, you probably know, where companies will reach out to me and they'll be like, we'd like you to come train our people, blah, blah, blah. I say, what's your budget? They're like, we don't have a budget. And I'm like, bye. That tells me I'm old because you're supposed to be like, bye. Because if you do this, then you're an old person,
Yeah.
which I am. Right.
Mhm.
And and they're not willing to invest or their budget is ridiculously low. Oh, $75. No.
Mhm.
No, I'm not going to do a training for $75. Sorry. Um, and then they worry about their skills gaps and that we're missing this and oh my gosh, this much. And the thing I say is you can have me come in and train your HR staff on the Family Medical Leave Act.
Mhm.
Or you can screw up and you can pay a lawyer $600 an hour to get you out of your mess. And maybe you end up paying a lot more because if you lose your case, hundreds of thousands of dollars. It makes my $3,000 training fee seem a lot more reasonable than than 600 bucks an hour for a lawyer to do 100 hours of work, which would not be uncommon in a lawsuit. But people don't look at it that way um, because the lawsuit is an unexpected business expense. And this is something that we haven't budgeted any money for training, Isn't there something free we can do? Don't you have anything free? No, I don't. Actually, I do have tons of stuff for free. Come join my Facebook group, but that's about it.
This kind of leads a little bit to AI because whilst there's real value and virtue in being a carpenter and really learning your craft, but I mean that takes years. It probably takes significantly less time to buy something from IKEA and assemble it. If you're really poor, you just buy something from a shop and they'll deliver it. And we live now in a generation where perhaps people don't know how to service their own cars or build their own furniture or fix their own things. It's all consumable, it's all disposable. And I think one of the interesting things about AI is that in some respects, it can narrow the skills gap. Now, suddenly you have everything you need to know a fingertip away. But in other respects, I think it broadens the skills gap. It gets wider because AI will give you the answer and you have no idea what that means. And you're reading this thing that AI has produced, but there's no depth of understanding, no lived experience of the recipe that it's just provided. And the fact that if it has hallucinated, you won't know because you have no experience on which to evaluate the advice, the skills that it's offering. Now, you've written a little bit about AI. I mean, what are your views on that?
I 100% agree with you. I do a lot with AI, especially with ChatGPT. Um, I train a lot of HR people on using ChatGPT, and those are the exact problems. Is that and the example I use in my training is you can ask ChatGPT or any of the Gemini or whatever out there, what is the US law regarding nursing mothers at work?
Mhm.
And it'll give you a really nice answer and it'll sound very competent and authoritative and it references the laws, blah, blah, blah. What it doesn't reference is that the law changed in July of 2023.
Mm.
And with ChatGPT, it's not up to date. The data source is still in 2022. So it doesn't have any knowledge of it. With Gemini, which used to be Bard, it's theoretically up to date,
Mhm.
but the way these large language models work is that they're not thinking.
Mm.
Everybody thinks it's intelligence. It's not. It is just pulling out words that go together. And so when I ask about breastfeeding mothers in the workplace, it looks at all of the words around that and of course, the vast majority of words around that are pre-July 2023.
Mm.
So it pulls in that information. Now, if you say, hey, wait, I thought that there was a new law in July of 2023, then it will pull in the information about the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act and the Pump Act. But you have to know that to get the right answer.
Mhm.
And it's the case with everything. One of my friends who does employee handbooks, she says she'll often have clients that are in one state, and every state has their own employment laws. There's federal laws overarching, but every state has different laws as well, and you need to be compliant in every state that you work in. So they're just everybody's located in Virginia. And then you expand, and now you have an office in North Carolina. And
Mhm.
so they will go to ChatGPT and say, will you please update this for North Carolina law? And it's a disaster. It's a disaster, but it doesn't look like a disaster.
Mhm.
It looks great because it'll pull in, here's this, here's that, and you're like, oh, I'm all good. Let's just go with that. And the reality is that most people will get away with it because most companies, nobody looks at their handbook anyway. And it's only when you get into a lawsuit that's an issue, and most companies don't get into a lot of lawsuits. And so you think it's fine, and it is fine, maybe in 90% of the cases. But if you're in that 10%, you're
Mm.
toast,
Mm.
toast. And that's that problem with AI. AI is really good at what it's really good at and terrible at everything else. If you have if you have one of those days where you're like, I hate everything, and you write this real nasty email, and we've all done this, and then you put it in your drafts folder, and then the next morning you delete it. And then you write something rational. You can take that really nasty email, you can put it into ChatGPT, and the phrase I use is professional, direct, and kind. And
Mm.
it'll rewrite it into a beautiful, professional, and direct and kind email. And you can send that, make all of your points professionally, directly, and kindly. That's amazing. That's so handy. But for solving your problem, for writing your handbook, for telling you what the law is, forget it.
Mm. I'm interested in that direct, professional, and kind. I think that's a great phrase to remember, um, which lends itself to memetics. And one of the things I'm quite interested in how we communicate with people with alliteration or sound bites or phrases. Um, and you're very good at that. You're a very persuasive speaker, and no doubt because of acting and improv and stuff like that. And there have been, in the UK, there's been politics where, the most important things are education, education, education. A famous thing said during the sort of New Labour. And every politician most leaders, they do have these sound bites. And I'm curious by that because it plays to heuristics. We stop thinking when we hear something that sounds good. And it's a little bit like what you're saying about ChatGPT. If it looks good, that's good enough. We won't examine further. We almost switch off our critical faculties the minute we see something that's perhaps pleasing to the eye or to the ear. I think that's quite interesting and must cause loads of dumpster fires in HR.
It does, and it's that lack of critical thinking, and we have our real focus today on emotions rather than facts.
Mhm.
One of the phrases that drives me nuts is that, you're denying my lived experience. And I'm like, no, I'm just stating the facts for you. That's you do you, honey, but here are the facts, right? And we used to say the plural of anecdote is not data. And now people want their anecdotes to be the reality.
Mhm.
And that is this huge problem within HR.
Mhm.
Um, One of the sexual harassment investigations that I dealt with, there was a case, this woman came in and said, hey, my coworker smacked me on the behind. And that's a no-no for anybody that wondered.
Mhm.
No, no, we don't do that, right? And the man in question is like, I have no idea what she's talking about. I never
Mhm.
hit her behind. I just passed her in the hallway. And it turned out there was a camera in the hallway. So easy peasy investigation. He was carrying a box,
Mhm.
couldn't see her, and the box hit her.
Mhm.
So she felt something smack her butt. He didn't notice.
Mhm.
Um, and off they went. He was 100% right. He didn't touch
Mhm.
her with his, he had no knowledge of it. She was 100% right in that somebody smacked her on the butt. But the reality was, is it wasn't a sexual harassment. It was a bump in the hallway. And that is the thing. But if there hadn't have been a camera,
Mhm.
two different lived experiences, neither one of them the fact, right? And not saying, I know that the UK is big on having cameras everywhere and more people are doing that, which is a different topic. But that the reality was something very different than either one of them experienced. And that can be a really tough thing. People talk about the he said, she said, but that's one of those situations where neither was lying,
Mhm.
but they both experience these things, and that can be really, really complicated in dealing with within an environment, because how do you come to a conclusion on what happened if if there wasn't a camera? Then it's talking to each of them and him saying, I have no idea what she's talking about, and her saying, yeah, he definitely smacked me on the butt. It was box. He didn't see it. Um, it's difficult. It's difficult.
I think that's a really is a lovely example, and I think it's really interesting. Just taking out in a slightly different direction, this concept of cognitive dissonance when we believe something so much that even evidence to the contrary, we will disregard it. That's a fairly popular soundbite right now is fake news.
It is something, yeah, the fake news, and they've done many studies on this um, that we will reject, and I use we on purpose because you and I are both humans. We
Yeah.
will reject anything that doesn't go with our preconceived notions. And one of the things that I do to try to avoid that is I look at things from all sides. And I'll have people say, oh, this person should be fired because he liked this person's tweet. And I'm like, listen, I like tweets that I disagree with all of the time because that tells the algorithm that I want this in my feed because I
Mm.
want to see the other opinion.
Hmm.
And a lot of people don't want to see the other opinion. And the algorithms that we have today on social media reinforce our current opinions. So if I like yours, then it's going to show me more of you. And if I don't like you, then I'm not going to see any more of your opinion. I want to make sure that I am seeing all of those opinions. Does that make me perfect and unbiased? Of course not. I was perfect and unbiased to begin with. But it doesn't fully fix the problem because we're all biased, but it does help that I can explain this side and I can explain this side and explain why I'm where I am. A lot of people can't do that. They're like, well, because, and they'll give this cartoon caricature of the opposite side, which shows that they really don't understand where it's coming from.
And it's interesting the extent to which we identify with stuff. I mean, all the time, we're all humans. So if you're into football, you may identify with your football team. I'm always struck by somebody who says, we won this weekend. And I say, what's the wee bit? You're a
That's right.
thousand miles away in front of a telly with a can of beer. You're not really a footballer. But when we truly identify with stuff, then we start seeing the emergence of identity politics, which basically says if something doesn't fit, it's not that I disagree with you factually or emotionally. It now starts to undermine my identity because I'm so heavily vested in that thing. Um, and I find it really interesting, human nature's ability to categorize and classify everything. And I think therein is a problem. We don't really respect difference. We objectify it and then pathologize it. I think it's all very messy, and I can imagine with identity politics as it is currently, that's another dumpster fire for UHR people.
It is a dumpster fire. It's a huge dumpster fire, and there's a lot of HR people that fuel that dumpster fire instead of trying to put out the dumpster fire. And one of the things that I need to preach a lot more about, but I don't. I need to. I'm going to do that this week. I'm going to preach about this. Is the importance of knowing what it means to succeed.
Mhm.
So what does success look like? And you need to know what success looks like before you start, because otherwise, how will you identify when you succeeded? So when someone says, we want to be better at DEI, okay, great. What does that mean? What does that look like? And they'll often just focus on the diversity aspect. I want to be able to run a report and see that we have X many Black, this many Hispanic, this many white, this many Asian. Um, and you have now companies also asking people sexual orientation, which people don't like, by the way.
Mm.
But I'm like, listen, if you want to measure it, you got to know, right? Otherwise, how do I know? Um, and they just want to check that off. But I'm like, well, how are you measuring inclusion?
Mhm.
And nobody has that. And so how do I know if my efforts are working? Because just because you have a rainbow of people in your office doesn't mean that you've mastered inclusion. What if they all hate each other?
Mm.
That's not inclusion, right? Um, and people haven't thought that far. And so, as I said, there's been a huge backlash in the US and somewhat in the UK as well, against this. And you have state governments banning it in state organizations and universities, and they're saying, oh, this is terrible. And I'm like, well, what did you do? What what's what were you working for? Well, we're working for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, but how do I know that you've succeeded? And if you can't articulate that, and I'm sure that there are some people that can, but they're not making the news because that's not really newsworthy, right? There's no drama in that.
Mhm.
Um, if you can't articulate how I know when we've succeeded, then also how do I know when we've reached our goal?
Mhm.
And we don't need to continue to throw more money and put more things at it because we've reached it. We're doing it now. If you can't articulate that, it's just all about power that I need more money. I need more money. I need more money. I need more money. I need more money for my department to grow it and grow it and grow it. But how do I know if you've reached the goal? You don't know what your goal is. We
I
don't know
think
what the
uh, I think that's a what do you do? I think that's a marvelous observation and opens up a whole, I think, podcast in itself about performance and how we measure performance and how we value performance versus competencies, process versus outcome, behavior and attitudes versus productivity. I think the whole space right now can be a little muddy and confusing. There is a tendency, I suspect, to measure things that are easy rather than things that are important. Um,
yes.
and I think one of the I'm going to go into nerdy mode very briefly because I'm a bit of a sort of data compliance regulatory type of chap, as some of the stuff that I do. So in data protection and general data protection regulation, you can harvest data providing you're transparent about it and it's for an explicit purpose and you are reasonable about that purpose, etc. And so very often if you're working with organizations to gather the data, the next question is, so what exactly are you doing with that data? And if they can't articulate, well, we need it because you use it for this, the answer is, well, if you don't have a legitimate reason that you can clearly articulate, then you shouldn't have the data. And so there's this almost catch-22 that we have a tendency to harvest loads and loads of information just in case and then don't really use it, which has problems, or indeed we fail to get data on the things that are really important.
Back in my previous life, my degrees are in political science.
Mhm,
Um, and and the science part of political science is the statistical analysis.
mhm,
Um, and in graduate school, they beat over our heads not to do what we call data mining, which is
mhm,
you take your data set and you just keep doing stuff until you find something that looks cool. And you can see examples of this all over the internet. They'll be like, oh, look how these two completely unrelated events correlate perfectly. You see that and they're funny. But that can happen when you're just combing through the data and you don't know what you're looking at to begin with. You don't have a goal with it. Or you have no intention of using it. Like you said, they want to collect data, and companies do this all the time. They'll do an employee engagement survey. And employees will give feedback. And then the powers that be don't like the feedback. So they dismiss it. And that actually causes more damage than not doing the survey in the first place. And I always tell people if you're not going to act on it,
mhm,
don't do the survey. Knowledge, if you're not going to act on it, it's just going to make people angry because if I and all my coworkers say, I don't like this, and this, and your employees talk to each other. They all know what they put on the thing. So they know that this came up, and then you just ignore it.
mhm,
Or worse, you're like, oh, it's like a, Vladimir Putin election. Everybody voted for him.
mhm.
Surprise. So if you run an employee engagement survey and come back with everybody's really supportive of the direction the company is going, um, people know when you're lying.
Mm.
Really damaging. You got to be careful with your data collection and then what you do with it. If you're going to collect it, you need to do something positive with it.
I think that's another great insight. I have to say, one of the things I'm also interested in because of change management and coaching and stuff like that is this dial between influence, persuasion, and then if you turn it up to 11, it looks like manipulation and stuff like that. On our capacity to, for example, really have an impact on staff surveys simply by saying, well, what time do you run it? What environment do you run it in? Do you offer them a free bacon roll and a cup of coffee and half an hour in which to do it? We know all of these things will have a profound impact on how they feel and therefore how they respond at that particular time. and you know the weather outside, the season of the year, and the cultural political environment in which they're working right there and then. All of these things have an influence, and sometimes we just look at the data and not the context. And if you just look at data without context, but you're a statistician. I mean, I imagine sometimes statistically you are looking at data and it's very difficult to see what function context had.
Well, that's a really important thing on context. I don't call myself a statistician anymore because it's been a long time since I've done statistics, but I can read that and understand the backing. But yeah, context does matter. And um, one of the things that I will tell people as well is if you're conducting an investigation and you're interviewing an employee about something that happened, don't just write down their answer, write down the question.
Mm,
Because a lot of times the question informs you about the answer more than the answer did. It really is important. Like all of those things that you said, oh, we're going to offer a gift card if you fill this out. It influences who is going to be willing to fill it out. Yeah, if you offer me delicious pastries before you ask my opinion, I'm going to be in a good mood because I
mm,
like delicious pastries, right? All of those things are important, and people don't
mm,
really think about that type of thing. And those things also more than just data collection, a lot of the cry is, give us better pay, not pizza on Fridays. Pizza on Fridays is actually really beneficial, towards I don't care. Everybody, not everybody, but most people really like food
mm.
and they'll respond to that. And it gives them warm fuzzies about working. Now you can't underpay people and make that up in pizza, but your properly paid people like pizza. There's alliteration for you.
Paid for pizza represents performance um, progress for we'll think of something.
Pepperoni pizza. We'll throw another P in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you. I honestly feel that there's another one of these that we could do just around sort of performance and measures and stuff like that. And also exploring more what you do about it. We've talked a bit about improv, but
Yeah,
I'm
but we haven't talked enough about it. And I haven't made a fool of myself yet.
sorry.
I said I haven't made a fool of myself yet with
Oh, well,
improv.
that's exactly why there will be a next time.
Awesome. It has been so delightful.
Well, likewise, I've tremendously enjoyed it. Suzanne, Zan, because we can say it,
Suzanne.
even
Suzanne.
if Suzanne, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me.